I'm John, the CEO. Let's get you caught up.
I've written articles on Tulsa's Black Wall Street, which was originally called Negro Wall Street in the past. So I won't go back over that detail in this video. Links are below. Instead, as today marks the 100th anniversary of the government-sanctioned war on a once very self-sufficient and very prosperous black enclave, I want to focus on why I use the words government-sanctioned. I also want to ask pointed questions about the circumstances leading up to the Memorial Day Tulsa ethnic cleansing of 1921. Often, when we analyze black history, it's tempting for many of us to let emotion take over the intellect. This is part of their strategy to distract us from the truth. Indeed, the massacre and ethnic cleansing that happened was and is very angering. No doubt, the images and descriptions of growing white mobs unleashed on smaller numbers of black citizens should trigger an emotional response. But we have to set aside emotions, at least temporarily, and put on our detective hats. Just like many of you love those forensic crime shows and movies, use some of that same energy when examining the facts. I won't have time to go over every major fact as the history is actually extensive. However, I will cover some of the major facts that non-black historians want you to overlook so that you don't see the truth. And if we don't know the truth, then they will always get away with these ethnic cleansings, which would later happen in Africa in the 1960s, among other areas around the world. We were the guinea pigs. So let's look at the facts like soldiers. Official historians want you to think there were not any credible witnesses to U.S. government warplanes dropping firebombs on Black Tulsa. This is a lie. One of the most intellectual black legal minds at the time, father of a great historian known as B.C. Franklin, the father of renowned historian John Hope Franklin, gave a very detailed description of the planes and how they maneuvered like military planes. Another educated black female teacher confirmed the same. Keep in mind, the U.S. Air Force at the time was in its infancy, so don't confuse them with today's Air Force. And if you think about it, name any other so-called race riot where government planes were used against black civilians. So, why, of all the black enclaves in America, did they just so happen to choose the Greenwood district of North Tulsa, arguably the most prosperous and independent black enclave in the world, to use U.S. government planes? Mind you, this was also the first American city in history that came under air attack at a time when the Air Force was trying to perfect its air superiority following a mediocre performance in World War I. Folks, this is no coincidence that Black Tulsa was used as a proving ground for the young U.S. Air Force. The only time the U.S. military used planes in warfare was in Haiti 2 years earlier in 1919, the same year that government sanctions anti-black ethnic cleansing erupted all across America. All those bloody race riots of 1919, remember those in history. As anthropologist Jean-Philippe Below noted, this was possibly, quote, the first ever carried out by air on civilian populations, the first air assault. Interestingly, the same U.S. government that supposedly freed us from slavery would put those Haitians into slavery after that air assault. Think about that. Now, is it a coincidence that yet another black enclave, which defeated France in the early 1800s, was the first region to have civilians massacred from the air by the United States? And these were the same kinds of planes used against Tulsa 2 years later in 1921. Again, this is the invisible hand at work, one that wanted revenge on Haiti for daring to defeat the home of their secret societies, France, over a century earlier. The same air assault pattern was used by the British military against civilians in the Middle East between 1920 and 1924, massacring many and leaving them homeless. Any coincidence that America's #1 ally used the same kinds of planes against civilians in then Palestine? Oh, I got time today. Before the so-called historians try to rebuff my inquiry, I actually researched the company behind the U.S. military planes. The official history wants you to believe that some random group of rich white Tulsa men just so happened to make a private acquisition of these planes and then plotted to use them on black citizens out of nowhere. My research showed that those kinds of purchases were very expensive, meaning the odds of several Tulsa residents just randomly buying them and then using them collectively for an air assault on North Tulsa is highly suspect. The cheapest Curtiss J-94 plane in 1919 was $7,500, which would be almost $116,000 in today's money. The $9,000 model would cost almost $140,000 today. The U.S. military had not done many aerial bombings before 1921, and the first notable one was done almost 2 months after the Tulsa bombing. Do you really believe that the use of several military planes on the richest black enclave in America was done by some random angry group of white dudes who just so happened to use military bombing tactics? Come on, people. Think. Tulsa was the richest oil city in the world at the time, but it wasn't that rich. If you look at the concerted effort at the federal, state, and local government levels to keep blacks from defending their own wealthy economy, while allowing paid white puppet leaders to lead mindless white mobs to kill and rob those same wealthy blacks, common sense leads you to conclude that this was indeed a concerted effort by the usual invisible hand in powerful circles who have always wanted to keep us as a permanent underclass. Don't let them fool you, brothers and sisters. Had this been the wealthiest white neighborhoods that came under air and ground assault, the federal, state, and local governments would have immediately killed every terrorist, quote unquote, involved. They didn't do it for us. So why didn't Greenwood get the same protection? When black World War I soldiers in nearby Muskogee, Oklahoma heard about what was going on in Tulsa, they immediately organized and started heading there, ready for war. Somehow, word got back to the feds, and a call from the Oklahoma governor to white police officers in the area forced those black soldiers to go back home, but not without a little skirmish. Yet the same feds allowed white soldiers to lead the mobs with machine guns against our people in Tulsa. I read this in a newspaper clip from 1921, not a history book, directly from the newspaper clip. Moreover, at the end of the Civil War, did not the government give reparations to white slave plantation owners who lost their valuables, including slaves? Did not the government provide protections for them, but failed to adequately protect newly freed slaves? Yet the state and local governments denied the claims to black Tulsans, all while the state-sanctioned militia led the white mob to ethnically cleanse North Tulsa. And yet, till this very day, the federal, state, and local governments refuse to pay reparations and want you to believe their half-truths about what really happened. Yes, they don't want to get me started on history, on true history, because I got receipts and a very probing mind, right? I am a true fan of history and will not be deterred, and neither should you. We got to stay on code. Let's revisit Buck Colbert Franklin's, B.C. Franklin's quote about the planes he saw that dreaded day 100 years ago. Quote, "I could see planes circling in mid-air. They grew in number and hummed, darted, and dipped low. I could hear something like hail falling upon the top of my office building. Down East Archer, I saw the old Midway Hotel on fire, burning from its top, and then another and another and another building began to burn from their top. Lurid flames roared and belched and licked their forked tongues into the air. Smoke ascended the sky in thick black volumes, And amid it all, the planes, now a dozen or more in number, still hummed and darted here and there with the agility of natural birds of the air. The sidewalks were literally covered with burning turpentine balls. I knew all too well where they came from, and I knew all too well why every burning building first caught fire from the top. I paused and waited for an opportune time to escape. Where, oh where, is our splendid fire department with its half-dozen stations, I asked myself. Is the city in conspiracy with the mob? Unquote. Did y'all hear that? Is a city in conspiracy with the mob? The answer is yes. Notice how detailed and precise he was in his description. The official historians want you to downplay his words in favor of theirs, as if this legal-minded brother was not that credible of a witness. Also notice that his statement about the fire department indirectly shows that race relations were not as bad as they wanted you to think leading up to 1921, if he wondered why they were not there that day, right? Why would he want them to come? Why would he make that statement? In other words, they must have responded to previous fires in Greenwood in prior years for him to then wonder where they were. Think on that. Think. Again, they want you to believe that the use of military planes was just a coincidence, that they were private sales. Recall that even today, when the U.S. military leaves a base in Iraq or Afghanistan, they conveniently leave behind a bunch of advanced military hardware that ends up in the hands of the so-called terrorists, right? Before you know it, the media is blaming Al-Qaeda or ISIS for attacks using this equipment, but they hardly ever refer to the fact that the U.S. and its allies left the gear behind in the first place. The same pattern is most likely what happened with the so-called private sales of these World War I Curtiss JN-4 planes in 1921 Tulsa. The company who made the planes, the Curtiss Aeroplane and Motor Company, became rich off these planes from the government. The journalists and official historians would have you believe the propaganda that racial tensions were brewing, that whites were jealous of wealthy blacks, that white World War I soldiers were angry coming back home from the war, that some young mystery brother named Diamond Dick inappropriately touched a white girl who conveniently was working as an elevator operator at the very and only building in all of Tulsa where black male workers would go use the bathroom upstairs. Why would a young white girl be at an elevator where black men went to? Think about it. Was it a setup? Why hire a white girl to work where black men frequent? Also, if whites were that jealous of us, why didn't they massacre us in the years leading up to 1921? Many of you don't know that Greenwood, Tulsa didn't just spring up overnight in 1921. It started as a black enclave vision way back in the late 1870s. The brother who came up with that vision knew exactly what he had in mind, and in the 1880s, it started taking shape just before the oil boom hit Tulsa. So ask yourself, if whites were so angry and jealous, why didn't they wipe us out before 1921? The first racial segregation law in America was enacted in Oklahoma in 1905. Surely, if whites were that jealous of us, they would have ethnically cleansed us right after 1905, but didn't. So why it would be 16 years after this law before blacks were massacred and run out of town? Does that make sense to you 16 years later? I read many newspaper reels from that era leading up to 1921, and they showed that although there was racism in Tulsa, it didn't rise to the level of whites wanting to massacre blacks. In fact, black Tulsans in the North and white Tulsans in the South largely agreed that both sides actually tolerated the status quo where blacks lived up north and whites stayed down south. The lower class black Tulsans would go work for white Tulsa families for years, bringing that money back to circulate in North Tulsa. See? For self-sufficient, prosperous, and educated black folks, this was perfect, as they didn't want to deal with racism anyway. Again, remember to keep your emotions in check for a moment as I'm putting you up on game. By using the propaganda buzzwords white jealousy and racial tensions, they calculate that we will stop right there and investigate no further. The same journalists and news media then who used this propaganda trick are part of the same families that run the media today. Keep that in mind. They control us by our anger, our emotions. We can no longer afford to do that because it has shackled our minds. An invisible hand has been at work against us for as long as we can remember. Does this invisible hand of men include white people? Of course, but not all white people are in this group. This intellectual neglect has plagued us, keeping us from finding the answers which can then get us back on track. The truth shall set you free, but the process to find the truth is ugly and well guarded by powerful secret societies who love to wear masks and hoods to keep you off their trail. If the official history of what happened in Tulsa 100 years ago is true, then why did they keep it out of school textbooks even till this day? Think about that. It's a cover-up for a reason, but don't let your eyes be blinded anymore. In the 1950s, many don't know that Black Wall Street did almost mount a full recovery, but government-sanctioned urban renewal and highway expansion projects would negatively impact Greenwood, just like many of our communities around the country that are now called ghettos and hoods. They were not always ghetto, my people. I'll leave it at that. Here's the powerful legacy we lost 100 years ago today. From now on, this is another annual reason to commemorate the Black businesses and World War I soldiers we lost 100 years ago, when our federal, state, and local governments waged war against us in Tulsa. Never forget until they and us, in general, get reparations, and then remember them perpetually. Be sure to show your support by hitting the like button and also following us and sharing this video. Until the next video, my friends, peace. I'm John, the CEO of AffluentBlacksofDallas.com. Thank you.